In this lecture, we're looking at William Occam, the great curmudgeon, the great grump, who, according to many people, came along and ruined the scholastic world. And if you're just coming to Occam for the first time, that description of Occam might sound a bit strange and a bit over the top. Why would one man be responsible for the destruction of the scholastic world? Well, if that's your response, you're not alone. There have always been historians and philosophers who have found in Occam not so much the man who tried to destroy everything, but rather the man who tried to salvage Christian philosophy from the prison of Aristotle. And we can begin by just giving a bit of Occam's life, just so that you know the context that he lived in before we move on to his philosophy and to his understanding of the task of scholasticism. Just like Duns Scotus, William's name really has more to do with his location of his birth than it does with his actual last name. The name Occam almost certainly comes from the area of Oak Hamlet, which is an area in Surrey, in England. And over time, the Oak Hamlet name becomes Occam. Like Scotus, we know very little about his early life. He was a Franciscan, and like Scotus, he was believed to have studied at Oxford. And it seems just as likely that he was teaching at Oxford up until the time when he really burst onto the scene in the historical record. Occam wrote a great number of things related to philosophy and to theology, but he didn't write as much as most people might think that he did, given the weight of his ideas on the scholastic method. At some point, Occam is called to the city of Avignon, down in the southern part of France, and so that tells you that this is during the Avignon papacy. He's called down there in 1324, and just what the problem is not all that obvious. It doesn't seem to be the case that he is necessarily being called simply for the fact that his theology is out of whack with the normal Catholic teachings. It just seems to be the case that as the papacy is split between Rome on the one hand and Avignon on the other, that there is a turf war that is provoking in the popes that are sitting in either city at any time to really leverage a heavy hand against the more outspoken or even the more rebellious elements within Europe. And one of the issues that's being fought over at this point, again, is not so much related to faith and reason, but rather it's related to the apostolic ideal of poverty. We mentioned in previous lectures about the renewal movements within the monastic orders. There were groups like the Franciscans that came along who really reacted against the opulence and the power and the money that was associated with the older orders of the monastic movement. And they preach a real simple apostolic poverty. And we noted that these groups are called the mendicant orders. That is to say, these are the orders that have no personal property, no money, and very often they have to beg for their daily bread or simply to survive. Well, this actually becomes a fight there in the city of Avignon. Of course, the papacy is there living in a pretty opulent palace, and the Pope himself very often was not believed to have to live according to this apostolic poverty. In many ways, he was supposed to live like a prince or one of the kings of Europe. Well, the Franciscans and all these other mendicant groups are coming along saying that Christ and the apostles were like them, that they kept themselves poor, that they had no property, and that therefore the true ideal of the monk is to live like Christ and the apostles. Of course, the papacy doesn't want this, because to suggest this makes it sound as if the Pope himself is not living according to the model of Christ or his disciples. Well, eventually Occam sides against the Avignon Pope, and he takes the side that the mendicant orders are closer to the truth, have more rational and biblical backing for their beliefs than those who oppose the mendicant poverty life of these new monks. As a result, Occam and the head of the order flee from the city. They are condemned, and Occam spends a significant part of his life really on the run. He flees in 1328 to the Holy Roman Empire, down in the area of Bavaria at the time, which is roughly around the modern-day city of Munich. And this is the court of the Emperor Louis IV. And Louis is going back and forth between the modern cities of Munich and Pisa. And so Occam essentially spends the remainder of his life within the court of Louis. And at this point, because of the nature of his accusations and the condemnations, he actually spends the rest of his life really, almost entirely, devoting his intellectual prowess to the issue of politics. In fact, in the history of political thought and theory, Occam is one of the preeminent medieval thinkers on the subject. He actually wrote a book in which he argued, surprisingly, that the Pope should not have control over the church. He argues that instead, it is the emperor, almost in this Constantinian model. The emperor must have control over the church. And it is the emperor's job to censure or to control wayward popes and all of these maverick people who are trying to impose their will, whether it's from Rome or from Avignon. Not surprisingly, June 1328, Occam is eventually excommunicated. You don't get to side against the Pope and then run and write books against the Pope's power and live to tell about it, so to speak. He's not actually executed for this, but he does spend the rest of his life excommunicated, and then he dies in 1347. Well, this story about Occam is important because one of the things that Occam is usually accused of is of simply being negative about scholastic theology. Those things that he did write about theology or faith and reason were during a time in his earlier years when he was being very critical. Occam is the guy, you might say, who says that the emperor has no clothes. He has studied widely people like Aquinas, Scotus, Lombard, all these folks. And he spent a lot of time really challenging their foundation. The problem, though, is then he seems to almost drop the mic, head off to Bavaria, and spend the rest of his life writing about politics. And so here's a man who has issued a number of challenges to the Catholic Church, issued a number of challenges to the scholastic method as it existed in his own day. And then he doesn't turn around and attempt to offer his own positive account as to how we ought to do these things. He somewhat paints himself into a corner, and even in his own writings, he admits that he's painted himself into a corner. And there is some evidence that he wanted to work his way back out to develop a more firm foundation of doing theological thinking and reflection in the context of the church. But because of the vicissitudes of his life, because of the politics that he got himself embroiled in, he really doesn't do this. And so again, he simply walks off stage just after having told everyone that they're wrong. Part of that reality, though, is why Occam is somewhat despised, depending on one's philosophy or one's understanding of the Middle Ages. One of the more interesting interpretations is that what Occam does is he muddies up the waters of the latter Middle Ages, that after the high water mark of Aquinas, men like Occam and his successors spent a great deal of time punching holes in the scholastic method, and thereby punching holes in some of the theological ideas of those who were scholastic. And the argument continues on that because of that malaise in the latter Middle Ages, that when you get to men like Luther, whose entire training was in this late medieval Occamist tradition, there's often an allegation that what Luther is reacting against is this bastardized, weakened, anti-scholastic theological outlook that Occam injected into the medieval world. And we don't have to go into all those interpretive differences. There are people who don't like that interpretation, and they see men like Occam in the latter Middle Ages as actually being something of a good thing, letting some of the air out of an overly expanded balloon of this scholastic, rational method. But that's not going to concern us here. But you have to know that Occam is often seen as this pivotal character. He's seen as the man who, again, says that the emperor has no clothes, he challenges all kinds of things, then he simply leaves theologians to their own devices to attempt to work their way back out of this. Well, okay, if that's the context, and if Occam is that important as the great curmudgeon, just what did he teach? What were his problems? Well, many of us will be aware of something that's called Occam's razor. This is a phrase that's often used not only in theology and philosophy, but more recently, at least in the last 150 years, it's used in the area of the sciences. And there's lots of different ways of conceptualizing Occam's razor. But in its original context here, two things need to be said. First of all, Occam is not the inventor of it. He's just the man who uses it so much that it becomes synonymous with his name. Secondly, though, what is Occam's razor? Well, Occam's razor is, in a nutshell, the belief that if all things are equal, take the simplest explanation as to why something is. If I walk into my children's room and the place is just simply ransacked, toys are everywhere, things are torn up, all this kind of thing, I can choose to believe that my kids were in there, but that a band of Hessian mercenaries stormed into the room, knocked everything over, and then ran out the door to go fight some war somewhere. Or I can believe that Gandalf is standing there, using his magic to make the place be turned upside down. Or I can take the simple explanation, which is that my kids are sitting right there in the middle of the room, themselves all disheveled, And I can say, well, the obvious answer is they messed this place up. Now, that's a more obvious example. But when you deal with people in the philosophy realm, one of the things that Occam notices about all of the medieval history of the scholastic movement that we've studied so far, even though we've only studied it at a surface level, one of the things that Occam notices, and he's right about this, is they always add explanation upon explanation to things when they don't need to. They take the Gandalf or the Hessian mercenary arguments rather than simply going with the more simple explanation as to why something is. Now, this is important to note. What is Occam doing here? Is he really being a curmudgeon? Is he trying to destroy the church? Is he trying to deny philosophy or theology? No. Occam, until the day that he dies, always argues that what he's doing is making sure that Christians don't get out over their skis. He's making sure that they're not basing their faith on an idealized concept that is only a figment of their imagination. Also, Occam doesn't really deny anything. He's not saying that some of these things don't exist. He's not trying to simply say, everyone shut up and stop doing philosophy. Rather, what he's doing is pointing out the fact that a number of those who were involved with the High Middle Ages and the scholastic movement in those days were assuming premises that gave them favorable conclusions in the end. And he doesn't like it. He thinks it's basing the theological house on a weak foundation. And lastly, one last thing before we go through this. Occam does not deny Christian doctrine. Often it's somewhat believed that because Occam is so bruising, he's actually brutalizing against those who follow a certain method. It's too easily assumed that what he's doing is actually attacking Christian doctrine. Actually, from the very beginning and all throughout his writings, he's very clear. He wants to actually salvage the possibility of talking about Christian doctrine. He's not trying to find a way to throw everything out. Rather, what he's doing is he's saying we've built our foundation on the wrong principles. And so therefore he wants to save doctrine by taking it away from the Aristotelian synthesis that so many people before him had assumed. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, as we've seen from the very beginning, all the way back to Lanfranc, to Abelard and Anselm, Aquinas, Scotus, all kinds of different folks. The very great question of the High Middle Ages is at what point can we describe Christian theology as an Aristotelian science? That's a key issue. The whole issue of faith and reason is more of the question fundamentally as to can we say that Christian theology is one of those subjects that Aristotle says that you can break down in all these different categories when Aristotle is describing the study of the natural world. And of course, in the Middle Ages, philosophy, Christian philosophy, is called the Queen of the Sciences. Now, of course, they don't believe that they're studying the natural world in that sense, but you might say that they believed that they were studying theology and the things of God, even God himself, in a way that paralleled and that could borrow substantively all of these methods that Aristotle had described for the study of anything that is true in the natural world. So what Occam is doing is he's saying, guys, Christian theology is not Aristotelian philosophy that we just simply build our doctrines on top of. It can't be that, he says. Christian theology is not simply the best version of pagan philosophy. Well, the way he gets at this problem and the way he tries to pull the rug out from under those folks who are so enamored with Aristotle is he goes to the issue of the categories. Aristotle had this book called On the Categories, which is one of the most important books in all of Aristotle's writings. In that book, he talks about 10 fundamental categories by which we can study the world around us. And these are ways of kind of parsing out and distinguishing between different things. In some ways, what Aristotle has here is a nomenclature system for how to process different mental, not experiments per se, but at least a process logically for how you go through different problems. And so each of these 10 categories are taken as pretty axiomatic for the majority of the world, in particular in the Middle Ages. The great problem here, and this is where historians have really helped us in the last couple of years, is that what happens in the Middle Ages is there arose a more or less debate as to whether or not Aristotle's 10 categories were more of a classification system, more of a mental exercise, or do these 10 categories actually describe things that exist in and of themselves, what we call entities? And that's a very important difference. If Aristotle's describing something that is more of a classification system, well, then you're not going to get overly enamored with each of these categories, and they're not going to take on this type of weight that they might if these things were considered to be entities of themselves. Well, in the High Middle Ages, in particular with SCOTUS, these categories become not just 10 names or 10 categories in the generic sense that Aristotle uses. Rather, you might say that these 10 categories become almost the code, the DNA of the universe itself, according to the medieval scholastics. And we can do a very concrete example of this. If I were to say the statement that I am related to my daughter, well, in the Aristotelian categories, there was one category called relationality, that you can describe how two things relate. That's very helpful in a categorization sense. Being able to realize that sometimes two things are related, and then describing how they relate, etc., is a very helpful category. You can think of all kinds of ways this could apply, for example, to the sciences. You want to make very careful distinctions about how things relate and how they do not relate. Well, what the medieval guys do with this category is they almost posit the idea that there is something called relationality that has a being unto itself. It's almost a thing. It's an entity. Now, it doesn't have substance. It's not a physical property like our bodies, but it's something that exists. So when I say I and my daughter are related, according to, say, Scotus or Aquinas or others, well, there is a being, an entity of relationality that brings together me and my daughter. Well, if you're not used to the history of philosophy, that sounds crazy. Let's just be honest. Why would somebody believe that there's something called relationality that exists as an entity so that when I and my daughter are compared, that our minds are somehow recognizing or tapping into this relational entity? Well, the answer is it makes philosophy work. It makes epistemology work. One of the great problems that had been inherited in the West from the Greco-Roman world is how do we know what we know? Now, you might think that's an easy question unless you've done some philosophy. But if you've even done a Philosophy 101 course, you'll know that one of the great problems is how do we know something? We talked about this in brief when we looked at pagan ideas. How do I walk around and see lots of different, let's say, stones and come up with the concept that they all relate somehow together? Or if I see lots of different trees, all different shapes, tall, thin, big, some with green leaves, some with the brown leaves, I somehow know in my mind that this is all the category of tree. And we talked about some of the strategies of understanding this. Well, by this point in the Middle Ages, by the time of Occam, the idea there was that because I recognize the relationality between these things, and because all these 10 categories of Aristotelian thinking have a substance, have a being, they are entities unto themselves. Well, the reason they go that way is because it just simply makes their philosophy work. The fact of the matter is if you don't have something objective, something that ties it all together, well, you're left sometimes only with the conclusion that I'm just simply making it up in my mind. I notice a different rock and I go, all right, I'm just going to call these two seemingly different things the same name. Well, as you can imagine, if it's all up to my mind to simply apply a word to two different things, well, that's not a very great foundation for assurance, is it? So what Occam does with his razor, metaphorically speaking, is he comes in and he says, guys, you cannot say that there is some entity called relationality or some other entity related to these 10 categories. What Occam is saying is you're assuming these things exist. You're not proving them first. And because of that, you're building up your philosophy on the wrong foundation. Now, if that's still not entirely clear for you, I think there's a great analogy that can actually help you understand this. I was just saying that when we're talking about how we know what we know, that what the Middle Ages had done, what these scholastics had done, is they had posited the reality that there are these entities that relate to these 10 Aristotelian categories. And I said that what is going on here is these entities make their philosophy work. Well, let's say you and I are playing a chess match, back and forth, and we have the standard set pieces in front of us, and I lay out a strategy to win the game. And then suddenly, about halfway through, I realize that my strategy, the grand plan for me to win the game and trash talk you the rest of the day, is not going to work. So the pieces that I have are going to fail. And let's say as we're playing the game, I simply bring in 3 new pieces entirely. Brand new made up figures. Here's the character of the toad. The toad jumps over 5 characters and immediately destroys your queen. It's a new one. I carved it myself. No one's ever played with this piece before, but here's the thing. It jumps over all the pieces in one move, lands on your queen, destroys her. and then immediately checkmates you. Well, obviously, I'm bringing new things to the board, I'm pretending like they exist, and I'm using them to make the system work. That is an analogy to what is going on, according to Occam, in the High Middle Ages. These guys have based their theology on Aristotelian thinking. They've gotten to the point where they realize that it doesn't actually hold their system together the way that they hoped that it would. And Occam's just going, no, you can't bring in those pieces. Those don't belong in the game. And maybe by now you'll see Occam really isn't the jerk that everyone thinks he is, at least not interpersonally, and I would say certainly not philosophically. What he's not doing is coming along trying to destroy the world. What he's coming along saying is, guys, you broke the game and you're just bringing in new pieces to make the game still go on. So what Occam ends up saying is, all of these ideas that we try to build up to make our philosophy work, all these principles, for example, when we're describing the Trinity, well, the Trinity was being studied and being explored, in part through some of these 10 categories. So that entity of relationality really does wonders for the doctrine of the Trinity. There's some entity, some principle, something that has being, that is in the very essence of who God is. Well, Occam is sitting there going, nope, can't bring that piece onto the chessboard. That doesn't exist per se. You can't prove it because you can't measure it, you can't describe it. It is simply something you've brought out of your mind because it allows you to keep playing. In the end, what Occam ends up arguing is that there really are only two principles that we can know based on philosophy, based on actual experience and reason. And the two that he provides originally, he says we can know that things exist. There is something that has an essence or a substance. And these are just big words to say something exists. So you and I have substance. We exist. He then says, outside of existence, outside of something's essence, the only other thing that we can explore and know for certain are the qualities that make up different things. So I'm middle height, Caucasian, male, brown hair, etc. Those are qualitatively different things about me than they might be about you. And so Occam says these are the only two that we have. Now he does eventually add back in the relationality piece, surprisingly, because he realizes, again, having painted himself into the corner, having been the emperor's got no clothes guy, he says, well, according to revealed religion, according to the Bible, there is something about relationality in the doctrine of the Trinity, and so he says that it would seem wise to keep that as the third option. All the others, off with their head. Get rid of them. And all this backdrop within Occam is the reason why he is called a nominalist. Now let's make sure we get these words right. There are realists and there are nominalists. Both of these names relate to how we know what we know. Back to that issue of epistemology that I mentioned before. A realist are the folks in the High Middle Ages. They are those who say, well, a universal thing, this concept that we're talking about, relationality, for example, the fact that I relate to my daughter, well, that principle of relationality is a real thing. It's something in the world itself. It's abstract, yes, we don't see it, we don't touch it, we don't taste it, but it exists. Occam is called a nominalist because he says, no, all these other categories besides the two or three that he allows are simply abstractions that we create in our minds. His philosophy, in other words, his approach to what we know, is that we simply can't prove that all of these things exist. So, Occam's razor means probably what's going on is that we come across a lot of varieties of different things, and our minds categorizes them as different things. We don't have to assume that they have being and essence simply because we see something has relationality. And so nominalism is often described as denying that universals exist. And of course, everyone freaks out. They think that this is some sort of postmodern relativistic theory. But I think if we take into account the previous statements, the previous history of the Aristotelian categories in men like Aquinas and Scotus, you'll perhaps understand why Occam landed where he did. Frankly, I think most people in the modern world would as well. Now, that doesn't solve the problem. Again, the problem with Occam's theory is that he is only negative, and he doesn't quite give us a response as to how we build our system back up. The other point of attack for Occam is analogous as well. One of the things that we've talked about throughout all these lectures on scholastic method is that one of the great issues for all of the scholastics is how do we know God and how do we describe him? The issue of faith and reason in many ways is asking the question, what are the appropriate channels by which I understand God? Is it simply through faith? All these things have no real rational philosophical basis, and I just simply say, well, the Pope says it, I'm just going to accept it as faith, even though it makes no sense at all. Now, of course, no one would say it that way, but that's really the kind of end result of that really obscurantist idea. The other side, of course, was taught by people like Abelard, which is that God has given us minds to think, and therefore philosophy is a good thing. And so any place where philosophy takes us, we must assume that that's where God wanted us to go. And so if our rational minds take us to a different conceptualization, a more rigorous intellectualist understanding of the Trinity, well, then that's our job. We're supposed to stop, follow our minds because God has given them to us. And that's more of the rationalistic method. By and large, most of the scholastics in the High Middle Ages find themselves somewhere in a dialectical tension between both of these extremes. Where Occam comes in, though, is he tends to be more on the obscurantist side than he is on the rationalist side. You might say, in other words, that Occam is a more intellectually defensible obscurantist. He's not meaning to. He's just simply applying the rules of logic and the principle of Occam's razor, as we call it today. And he's saying, when it comes to knowing God, we can't simply say that Christian philosophy, borrowing heavily from Aristotle and the Greco-Roman world, are the foundations for how we come to know God. And one example of this, Occam is entirely opposed to natural arguments for the existence of God. He simply says there is no ironclad argument from a purely Aristotelian philosophical standpoint that would give us a cogent, fully verifiable argument for God's existence that doesn't somehow at some point assume the argument before you make it. Now, if we go back to Anselm, of course, that's exactly Anselm's argument. He is, again, in that dialectical tension. He says, I do have faith, I do know he exists, but knowing that he exists means that I can use my mind to process the natural world in a way that does illuminate my knowledge of God. Occam, though, is far more pessimistic on this process. Occam attacks, in fact, Anselm's argument. He says there is no rational belief, there is no reason philosophically why Anselm's argument that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought really has any merit to it. In the end, for Occam, faith and reason are on polar opposites, at least in the sense that if you take reason as coming from pagan philosophy, from Greco-Roman philosophy, he basically says there are no resources here if we adopt their system, adopt their philosophies, adopt Aristotle's categories. There are no resources within that framework that can make us comfortable or satisfied with what the claims of the Bible are for our faith. So in the end, believe it or not, Occam actually believes that doctrine is, surprisingly, given that he's not a Protestant, he's writing hundreds of years before Luther, his argument is doctrine must come from Scripture. And this really does become a nominalist hallmark. Doctrine must come from supernatural revelation. How do we know that there's a Trinity? Well, we're not going to reason our way to that point. We know there's a Trinity because the Bible describes God as one God, but in the New Testament witness, that one God is clearly three persons. He's talking to himself. He's interacting with himself in a way that describes personhood, differences of not simply one God with three different masks, etc. Occam says the only reason to believe that about the Trinity is to already have an assumption that the Bible is supernaturally revealed. Philosophy won't get us to the doctrine of the Trinity or to any of our other doctrines. So in a way, though we sometimes are not very comfortable with where Occam takes his philosophical, curmudgeonly way of attacking the medieval synthesis, many students and historians are not always comfortable with the way that he says that you can't prove anything in philosophy related to the faith. There have been and there continue to be people who say, no, there's an element of philosophy, there's an element of the Christian mind that can engage with philosophy. Simply saying that philosophy is on the one hand and the claims of faith are on the other is insufficient, a lot of people will say, to Occam. I have a hunch, though, that Occam probably would agree with that comment. Again, he simply was attacking his predecessors for their over-reliance on Aristotle's categories. Sometimes people come along and burst the balloon, even if they don't have the faculties, the time, or the long life to create a better system that ought to be put in its place. I think in some ways we can be thankful for Occam that he does come along and say, guys, we can't do this. You can't bring all these things to bear on the faith. Aristotle's categories are not revealed from on high. They may be useful in a number of areas. They may at times even be somewhat useful in Christian theology. But to assume that these things have being unto themselves, that Aristotle's categories are how we do Christian thinking in and of itself, most people today would not be comfortable with some of those excessive claims of the realists in the medieval world. And, surprisingly enough, Occam's ultimate conclusion when it comes to doctrine is stick to the text. Get back in the Bible. It is only from supernatural revelation that we can claim some of the more core fundamental doctrines of our faith. In that sense, Occam is really more of a biblicist. And is it any wonder then that Luther himself, having studied all of his adult life in this nominalist tradition, himself develops a real allergy to Aristotle, scholasticism, and to its claims on the faith, and that Luther himself will say, let's get back to the text.